Chapter 48. Sunlight poured over the earth and stone, contrasting the rising haze of black clouds that loomed over the mountains in the south. Kallan sat, propped against a lone birch tree, staring at the sky and the storm behind them. Bound to the earth with a poison in her arm, she'd recalled the deluge of images that flitted back of the damp caves and the orange light constantly battling back the darkness, and a memory of the bitter tain wafting from a bowl. Through the darkness that enclosed her while the men pinned her to the ground, she'd sing it once again, the golden light of the Sade that flowed, and she remembered. Waking her senses, she cleared her mind and concentrated, and finally she found the Sade beyond her own, as Gudrun had tried reaching her ages ago. Kallan's gaze shifted to the headless corpse Rune had kicked to the side moments earlier. The blood cooled onto the ground and steam rose to the sky in a disorderly stream of white, which added a blackish-red melancholy to the terrain. Kallan averted her eyes from the corpse to the lake, where she could make out the peasant's golden hair. The distant sound of splashing water assured Kallan that the girl they found beneath the soldier was still bathing in the lake. She'd been bathing for nearly half an hour, desperately working to scrub the filth that had penetrated her flesh. Kallan hugged herself against the memory of Nordri's hands, his mouth, and his ditty sung in the dark. Blanketed in an empty shadow Kallan hadn't been able to place, Rune walked around the grave field, inspecting the stones and runes, leaving Kallan alone to brood. After a while spent exploring, Rune returned and dropped a pile of small salmon to the ground along with an armload of sticks and branches. He busied himself with the fire as Kallan leaned into her tree. "What did you do to them?" Rune asked. Kallan looked to Rune, who nursed a small stream of smoke from beneath the brushwood. The morning sun doused him in the various shades of yellow that contrasted the drab gray clouds looming behind them. He kept his attention on the kindling. "You were pinned to the ground by 4 men, he said, "all 4 of whom are now dead." He watched his fire as he spoke. No burns, no scorch marks, no blood. Rune blew at the base of the smoke as it flowed in a steady stream until the fire erupted from the ball of tinder, slowly at first, then faster as it settled onto the branches and twigs. Rune looked up from his work. "What did you do?" he asked again. Kallan gazed out at the lake. The waters had settled, unbroken by any disturbance, confirming the girl had finished bathing. "I took their scythe from them," she answered. The scythe is energy produced by all living things. Most can't sense it, and when they do, they often dismiss it. The fire crackled as she let the tension between them brew. She remembered their quarrel, his mouth closed over hers, and the manner in which he'd awakened her that morning. His striking her hadn't hurt with the scythe from Ethan's apple still healing her. She suspected he knew this somehow and bit her lip, refusing to allow herself to ask the question. "Sedkonas believe we exist because we borrow that energy." Kallan rested her head back against the trunk of the tree and stared off in the distance as she thought of such things as spells, the scythe, and an energy that harbors its own life force. When the body dies, the scythe passes from it and joins the scythe around us. "Can you live without your scythe?" Rune asked. "All life comes from the scythe," she answered gravely. "What do you think?" Rune didn't answer. Kallan pushed her fingers through her hair, desperate to rid herself of the impervious sense that she was sitting there naked and vulnerable. She fought the urge to take up a weapon, but stayed where she sat for fear any movement would further reveal her weakness. Content to be discussing something so natural to her, she continued without provocation. "The scythe within is always there, holding only as much as it can produce. Sedkona learn to recognize the energy. They learn how to use it within others and how to block it. An enemy can tap into a Sedkona caught unaware and draw the scythe out of her." Kallan studied the clouds again. "Like them." Rune nodded toward the forest where they'd left the bodies behind. Kallan nodded. "Like them." Rune propped the skewered fish over the flames. "You said all living things produce it," he said. "Animals, reindeer, elk?" Kallan smiled. "The trees, the water, the salmon we eat," she said. "Everything. The earth provides an endless supply we can tap into. So why use your own? Why not borrow from the earth's scythe?" She could see his hardened eyes taking in every one of her words with careful thought. Unlike the scythe within, the earth scythe is not harnessed, and it is harder to control. Rune nodded thoughtfully. "So you're weak," he said, and grinned as Kallan battled back the urge to launch into a full-scale demonstration of the Sage's power. Kallan crunched her nose. As weak as you trying to divert a river's flow from with your bare hands. And what of me? Rune asked, and Kallan dropped her shoulder as the anger ebbed. I don't know what you are, Kallan said. Why you... She remembered the scythe entering his body through his hands, traveling down his scythe lines to where his core should have been, and vanishing where a great shadow enclosed it instead. Exhaling, Kallan looked back to the sky as Rune dropped his attention to the fish. Finished with her bath, the peasant girl walked, weak and frightened out of her senses, over the freshly turned earth and entrenched stones. She tucked her long playing hair behind her ears, which dripped water from the front of her hang-yoke. As she walked, she hugged herself, which did little to cease her violent shaking. High cheekbones protruded sharply, pulling her pallid grayish skin taut, and emphasizing her lack of nourishment. The gray of her round, sunken eyes matched the mountain sky, giving her the appearance of the headless corpse nearby. The girl came to stop several feet from the fire, doing her best to not look at the bloody mass behind her as she shifted her gaze uneasily between the Alfheim. Thank you. Her voice lilted with an unexpected brogue that forced Rune to look up from the fire. The woman-child appeared dwarfed at 2 heads shorter than Kallan. Perhaps too long, she admired Kallan's tapered ears and flawless, luminescent skin glistening in the sunlight. You are of the elven race, from the south beyond Viken. In reply, Kallan fished through the contents of her pouch, withdrew a small stoppered bottle, and extended it to the girl. Brewing with inquisitiveness, Kallan saw in his eyes. Rune stared at the bottle in Kallan's hand. With hesitation, the girl reached it, and swiftly, Kallan grabbed the girl's wrists and held her. Before the girl could gasp, golden threads of scythe flowed from Kallan's hand and snaked up the girl's arm to her shoulder. Enraptured, Rune watched the workings of Kallan's scythe as the girl's face filled out, her bruises faded down from her pale complexion, and her eyes glowed with radiance, replacing the shallow, pallid color that haunted her. The golden sheen of her hair returned as the strands thickened. As the last of the scythe threads ended, Kallan released the girl's hand, leaving the human free to gape with widened eyes. First at her own hand, which she turned over twice, then at the Sidkona. You're a witch, the girl said. One of the Hagdesi? Kallan smiled. Her sudden light-heartedness plunged the whole of her disposition in a warm glow that noticeably drew Rune's attention. Witch? Hagdesi, Kallan said, blushing at the additional attention from Rune. I haven't heard those words since I studied abroad in Jorvik. I am Sidkona, Kallan said, still glowing. You're from the lands north of the Umbra River. What do you call yourself? Shame weighed heavily on the girl's shoulders, bearing down the visible doubt that rested there. Her shyness made her seem shorter than she already appeared. She lowered her eyes as if inhibited by her error, and softly answered, Emma of Lothian. Emma risked a glance up, alternating from Rune to Kallan, seemingly unsure which of the two she should address. Deciding to stay silent, she forced her eyes back to the ground. Emma of Lothian, join us, Rune said. He nodded to the ground between himself and Kallan, and waited for the girl to take her place beside them. Tucking her knees beneath her with an efficiency that confirmed she was used to obeying orders, Emma kneeled where Rune indicated. How did you come to be here in the north? He asked. Emma shifted her eyes to Rune, then back again to the fire before answering. Last summer I and my husband Ivan of Dolor left Engla. Ivan wished to return to Dolor. He has a farm there. Had a farm. She corrected herself. I was on my way to Nidaros when... Emma afforded another glance to the headless body and shrunk down closer to the fire. Dolor is a day's walk from here. Rune's eyes hardened with pensiveness. How did you come to be this far east of the Dovrefjall alone? Ivan and I were working on the farm when Olaf arrived with his troops, she said, gazing back to Rune. They killed everyone. I hit him on the dead, and when I came out, I was alone. Ivan... Her voice cracked, and she lowered her eyes again, unable to continue. Saying no more, the girl hugged her legs to her chest and settled her chin in the crook of her knees. She barely moved when Rune handed her a skewered fish from the fire. We are heading to Nidaros ourselves, Rune said, once Emma's fish was half gone. The roads aren't safe for everyone. We can assure your safety along the road there. Thank you, Emma mumbled, and devoured the last of her meal. Rune handed her another skewer of the fire and jabbed at the coals within the flames. Within an hour, Olaf's troops will swarm these lands, he said. We need to put as much distance as possible between us and these corpses before nightfall. After we've filled our stomachs, we'll head out. We'll have to move fast. Emma, the girl turned her clear eyes to Rune. You can ride Astrid. As Emma devoured the last of the fish, Kallan looked to the south, where they had journeyed down from the mountains of Jotunheim. Like a plague that stretched over all of Midgard, black clouds annexed the sky. A chill prickled her back, and darkness moved in over the Dovrefjell, carried on the wind as if Olaf himself was leading the storm that was coming for them. Within the hour, the rains began peppering their small caravan with pellets that left them drenched. Kallan was more than willing to lend Emma the overcoat along with the blankets they had obtained from Ori, sheltering her somewhat from the elements, as they moved out of Opland into Trondelag. There the mountains stretched down with endless greens of pine that complemented the drab blue-gray of the clouds overhead. Their road strayed from the river, abandoning them to the generosity of the land and fortune. Kallan stumbled alongside Astrid, appearing to be permanently peeved at Rune, as she shifted a suspicious eye to every unusual shadow lingering in the trees. The constant, anxious glance from Kallan did little to ease the Liosafa's mood. Aside from the elation of picking off a pair of rabbits, Rune doled out a good portion of his own foul mood back to Kallan. Oblivious to their threatening charades, and grateful for their company, Emma rode along, too weary and miserable to say much of anything. The rains persisted into the evening, coming to a slow end an hour after the sun settled beyond the mountains. In the russet and gold of overgrown foliage, long after the deluge ended, they found an abandoned lean-to tucked away. Rune pulled Emma's stiff body from atop the horse. Her frame seemed delicate and too easily broken, like a child's in comparison to the Alfheim woman he had known. Taking care not to drop her, Rune held Emma by the waist as he waited until she found her horse legs beneath her. After regaining her balance, the Anglian bounced along the clearing, restoring the blood flow to her legs. Exhausted, hungry, wet and cold, and eager for supper, a pipe and a mead, Rune turned back for the rabbits and stopped short. Kallan's menacing gaze met him there as she scrutinized, trialed, assessed, and condemned him all within a glance. After a moment, Kallan left him alone to the pair of rabbits as she hugged herself against the chill that wasn't there. The opportunity was too ripe, and the circumstance irresistible. With a wide grin, Rune made up his mind to play the game, eager to keep the simmering fire inside Kallan well stoked, lest she withdraw to her lies behind her iron wall. Although, Rune mused as he gutted the rabbit, appealing greatly to the sadist within, his imagination flourished with the thought of having to provoke her all over again. Exchanging sneers, Kallan and Rune sashayed and danced as they settled into their routine around Emma. He collected firewood, she tethered Astrid and removed the saddle and furs. A fire roared, and soon the scent of roasted rabbit filled the air. Claiming a small area beside the fire, Emma took the liberty of drying herself in its warmth. Still awed over the difference Kallan's sayeth had made, Rune, not so discreetly, dragged his eyes over the woman from Lothian. The wear and abuse from her life had vanished, and she glowed with the radiance of the Vanir. A flash of gold caught Rune's eye as Kallan passed an apple to Astrid. She planted a kiss on his velvet nose, and bored, hungry, and exhausted, Rune remembered their morning. His eyes lingered on the soft line of Kallan's neck, and soon his eyes wandered with his imagination. Mid-fantasy, Kallan spun about and met Rune's gaze in a way that suggested a sudden urge to ignite the Leosifar in flame. Through the beast, Rune felt a ball of scythe manifest itself inside Kallan's palm. Rune cocked his head and grinned, egging Kallan on. Her scythe built. I walked these roads with Ivan once. The sudden lilt of Emma's voice broke the tension. Rune's amusement and Kallan's focus on her scythe dissipated. He told me these shelters were built years ago by the Jarls of Leith to encourage merchants and traders over the Dovrefjell. Making her way to the fire, Kallan settled herself opposite Rune, who rotated the skewers. Emma watched the flames lick the air. I overheard Olaf talking to his captains about building more shelters along the trade routes, and mapping the ones that are here, Emma said. Rune and Kallan exchanged glances, their petty issues forgotten for the moment. What else did you hear? Rune asked, passing Emma a stick of roasted rabbit. Emma stifled a yawn as sleep settled in. More than I wanted of the dying, she said. Nothing of Olaf. Emma stared into the flames. I remember the cries of children. And the growing pile of tiny hands. A tear rolled down her cheek, and with a trembling hand she roughly brushed it away. I wish I could forget, she said, her eyes deep and sullen, as if she hadn't slept in days. Unable to eat, Emma gazed instead at the rabbit, then looked again to Rune. The orange firelight danced over her face. I remember seeing Olaf when we passed through Angla last year. Rune froze. Olaf was in Angla? He asked. Emma nodded. For a little more than 4 winters. He stayed and terrorized the people after winning the Battle of Meldun. Everyone feared drawing his interests. He caused a lot of heartache to Ethelred, from what Ivan said. Why were you and Ivan looking to leave Lothen at all? Kallan asked. Emma's cheeks flooded with red. Ethelred wasn't ready to give up Edinburgh to Elba. Emma lowered her voice, and King Kenneth was moving in to take it by force. After the wars with Dansrich and the wars with Mierkna, Emma counted, and the wars with Elba and Northumbria, and the conflict growing in Aslant between the High King and Voru, Emma shook her head. Ivan wanted to settle down and return to Dolfra, take up his father's farm, try for a family without fear. Emma dropped her head and swiped at another tear. We only arrived last summer, she said. We stopped off in Bjorgvind and made port in Nidaros. Ivan and his family there. We just started to get things going on the farm. Emma's voice trailed off. It feels like Olaf followed us here straight from Dublin. Do you know why Olaf left Dublin? Rune asked, eager to keep her talking. Emma shook her head. No one knows, really. Many just talk of mindless speculation. Some say he was growing restless in the shadows of Sigtrig. Sigtrig? Rune interrupted. Sigtrig Silkbeard? Emma nodded. How does Olaf know Silkbeard? He asked, paying no mind to Emma's sudden wariness. A few years back, Olaf married Sigtrig's sister, she said. Rune set up his mouth agape. He married Gyda? What's wrong? Kallan asked as Emma nodded. Sighing, Rune rubbed his hand over his face repeatedly before answering. Gyda and Silkbeard are 2 of the Amlav Quaran's children. Rune dropped his shoulders while Kallan blankly stared at him. Who is Amlav Quaran? She said. Was, Rune corrected before Emma could speak. He was the greatest king of the Ilimar, the dynasty of Ivar, the boneless son of Lodbrok. Their family spanned Ersland, Elba, Strathclyde, Northumbria, Jorvik, even Mierkna. Bloodaxe and Quaran warred for the land. Quaran's skill in battle exceeds the songs of bards. It still is one of the strongest families in Dublin. And Olaf married into this line through Gyda, Kallan said. It's more than that, Rune said. Amlab Quaran's oldest daughter married Mer Sheknel Mekdomnel. Kallan stared, oblivious to the name, as Rune waited, expecting her to react. Mer Sheknel Mekdomnel, Emma answered for Rune, is the High King of Ersland. Husband to Gyda's sister, Rune said. Kallan's eyes widened with understanding. And her brother, Silkbeard, Rune added, is king of Dublin, Kallan concluded. To anger Olaf would be to arouse the attention of the greatest family known to Ersland since Concobar MacNassa and Eire herself, Rune said. It wouldn't be a small fight we'd be picking. Kallan smiled with a twinge of delight in her eye. Do you have plans to go picking? She asked of Rune, who had a sudden urge to kiss her. What about you? Emma asked. What king do you serve? A smile split Rune's face as he realized they had not yet given their names. The girl had been so eager to not speak that they had welcomed the chance to get on their way. I serve the Liosavar, Rune replied. I am Rune Tryggvason, king of Gunir. He nodded politely, earning himself a snort and an eye roll from Kallan. Emma blushed and lowered her eyes to the ground as if suddenly conscious of the company she kept. You must be a great king to bring only a thrall through Midgard, she said. Rune threw his head back and openly laughed loud and long. He felt the save and Kallan collect. Kallan, she said with a gentle smile, daughter of Eof, lady of Lorlenalin and queen of the Dogafar. Emma eyed Kallan's rags. It's a long story, Rune whispered to Emma, leaning in closer than necessary. Kallan clamped her teeth, and her pool of a mass save grew. His adversary, Kallan forced a kind smile and nodded at Rune. My prisoner, Rune grinned mischievously. His warden, Kallan snarled at Rune. My nad, Rune beamed. Emitting a girlish growl, Kallan stood as Rune widened his smile, holding his full attention on Emma, while Kallan marched off through the trees, slapping back the leaves and foliage as she went. Emma hid her mouth behind her knees and flushed, a brighter shade of red that glowed on her pale Anglian skin. Strands of her long golden hair fell to her face. I'm sorry, she said. Rune shrugged. Don't be. Kallan's oversensitive and under-emotional. That's why I brought her along. So, do you have kin in Nidros? Holding her breath, Kallan dunked her head beneath the water surface and rose again, sleeking her hair down her bare back. It was easy to forget her troubles in the middle of a vast Nordic lake, surrounded by tall pines and clean water in the silence. The light of the waning moon danced on the black water. The storm clouds had passed, taking with it the fog and leaving behind the vibrant green waves of Odin's lights that painted the clear, open sky. The sharp pain that stabbed at her chest every time she thought of Rune smiling at Emma had dissipated to a dull nuisance she cursed beneath her breath. Free of the fierce panic that no longer provoked her worries, Kallan's thought wandered back to Dagon, Gudrun, Eric, Eolf, and the children left behind in the warrens. She stared at the lights for a long while, then dipped her head beneath the icy waters, purging the worries from her consciousness and forcing herself to forget. She forgot Rune's face when he sliced through the neck of the soldier seated on top of Emma. Kallan wiped the water from her face, gasped, and dunked beneath the surface again. She forgot the wretched mourning that began with Rune's blade over her, and his words, his kiss, and the burn of his hand as he struck her. Raging ripples broke the water's surface, and Kallan dove again with a gasp. She abandoned all thoughts of the Dvargar and the pungent taste of their drug that robbed her of her senses, sanity, and her save. Kallan surfaced for air and plunged again into the lake, silencing the countless nightmares of Dagon's screams as she watched him consumed by saith flame. She recalled Rin's wide, clear eyes and the curl of Latha's bottom lip as Kallan waited for her body to adjust to the cold. Pale pinched her chest, and she battled to breathe as she recalled a certain promise. "I'll be down first thing in the morning." The children had been expecting her. The children were waiting. Kallan resurfaced, releasing a gasp, and cleared her mind until all that remained was a single hunter deep in the forests of Alfheim, holding the tips of her fingers. Her insides warmed as they twisted with discomfort. Engulfed in memory, she swam to the bank of the lake, holding her eyes on the lights where shadow couldn't go, the lights that were free of the Dvargar. Kallan walked to the patch of brush where she left her clothes well over an hour ago. She shivered against the damp, cold cloth as she pulled the woolen tunic over her head. Her attempt at scrubbing the filth from her clothes left them stiff and cold against her skin. The hem stopped mid-thigh. One leg after the other, Kallan pulled on her trousers, reminding herself of the shredded chemise Rune had stripped from her only days ago. Another wave of warmth rolled through her, and she cursed her stupidity as she fastened the twine at her waist. "It's too easy to forget everything here in Midgard, miles away from Lorlenalin and Gunir," Rune said. Startled, Kallan jumped, hugging her front protectively. There, leaning too comfortably against a birch in the shadows, Rune stood, arms crossed, and wearing only his trousers, his boots, and a grin. Heat burned every inch of her body as she felt her face flush red. Shaking, Kallan tied the twine at her waist. "None of us should wander off alone," Rune said, as Kallan sat down on the ground where she wrapped her feet and crammed them back into her boots. "How long have you been there?" she said, releasing her second foot. Rune grinned, matching the mischievous sparkle in his eye. "Long enough to know you haven't traveled north to see the lights like this before." Another wave of heat, and blood rushed to Kallan's face, then poured down her neck, and Kallan reached for her sword before remembering she'd left it back by the fire. They shine differently here in Trondalag," Rune said, raising his eyes to the sky. Stunned by his impassiveness, Kallan stared, forgetting her anger almost immediately. "We should visit Lofot and Varkvat up north in the winter sometime. Although, I recommend going by boat," he said. "The cliffs and mountains are merciless in the winter." The ribbons rippled. "They are beautiful," he whispered. "Some nights I would lie awake wondering why the spectacle isn't accompanied by a battle cry. I would spend hours walking all night beneath them, straining to hear their horses' hooves beat the skies and Heimdall's horn leading them on. But they are silent." Rune shook his head, still staring at the sky. "They shouldn't be silent." Trembling, Kallan closed her eyes, ignoring every word save one. "We?" Rune dropped his attention from the lights as she peered through the dark, hating him. "Why would I ever travel anywhere with you ever again?" Kallan seethed. Rune gave a look that feigned hurt. "You act as if we're enemies. You know, if things had been different between our people, our families would have married us off to each other ages ago. You would be my wife right about now, broken into obedience." Flames consumed Kallan's hand, and Rune only grinned. "You killed my father!" she screamed. Her words echoed over the lake as all joviality fell from Rune's face. Kallan forced each breath, panting, as she shook with rage while the silence returned, and she extinguished her flames. "Why are you here?" she whispered. Rune arched a brow. "The Dvagar took you, dragged you across Midgard—" "No! Here! The lake! Now!" A single strand of wet hair caught in Kallan's breath. "Where's Emma?" Kallan said, desperate to change the subject. "She's fast asleep," Rune said. "I had to be sure her bed was warm before dragging myself away to find you." His answer punched her stomach like a dagger dipped in dragon bile. Nausea churned her insides, and Kallan clenched her fists for want of her sword. "I can take care of myself," Kallan said through clenched teeth. "You always act so tough," Rune said, not bothering to hold back the amusement that dripped in his voice. "Like you're something I should fear. Bold words for someone whose neck was lingering beneath my executioner's axe a moon ago!" "You always have to be so spiteful." Rune pushed off the tree, then widened his eyes with sudden ingenuity. "This is because you're weak." "What is it with you?" Kallan shrieked. "Constantly pushing me, saying whatever pops into your head, knowing it will drive me to kill you. Do you want me to kill you?" "You must be exhausted brooding as much as you do all the time," Rune replied. "I'm curious. Did the Dvagar find you to be this much trouble?" Hurt flashed in her eyes, and Kallan spun on her heel, eager to return to her bedroll and sword. But Rune was on her from behind, wrapping his arms around her so tight he might have crushed her. "It's still there." The heat of his breath grazed her ear. "Every bone they broke, every beating, every day you spent chained to the floor like a dog, lingering beneath the surface of that wall you have up." The memories flooded in, and Kallan threshed, trying to break Rune's grip. "Release me!" Rune tightened his hold. "You will remember their filth," he said. "Every bruise, every break, every sound that stifled your senses." All at once the Dvaga stench flooded back. Nordri's voice, his smile, the bitter tang in the darkness. She wouldn't remember and falter. Not where he could see. Not he who was to blame for her capture in the first place. Kallan released a shrill, and Rune pulled her around to face him, pinning her arms to his chest before she could regain the sense enough to run. "Tell me," he said, "are you elated for what they did to you? Eager to thank them? Or do you deny what they did to you completely? Where's my sword? Where's my sword?" Kallan searched the ground, desperate for the blade she left behind. "Your hands aren't good enough for the likes of me," Rune said, riling her further. "You have to resort to cold steel. I want to feel you writhing on the end of my sword as I run you through." Her voice carried across the lake, filling the night beneath the lights. Rune smiled through his retort. "I could say the same to you." Like a banshee, Kallan screamed and flailed about. Rune flexed his arms to keep her in place, squeezing as her anger flowed like magma. "You're a spoiled Lyasafa prince!" Kallan cried. "Thinking you could bend a woman if you ruffle her skirts the moment she swoons!" Rune held his grin. "And that's only half the offenses I've shown you. Perhaps I should have been kinder. Broken your nose?" Kallan growled, refusing to remember. "Not here, not now, not with him. Beaten your sides until your bones broke under my fists." Kallan swung her foot, but Rune crushed the feet out of her before she could land a kick. "Kicked you in the face?" he said. Kallan turned her claws to his chest, and he took her claws. He let her draw his blood, and held his feet planted firmly into the ground, balancing their weight as she threshed about. "Crushed your hand into powder!" he hollered against the strips of blood she dug out of him. "But no!" Rune purred. "I really showed you, didn't I?" He added a laugh and tightened his grip. "I beguiled you!" Kallan's screams permeated the valley, leaving behind the echoes as she sunk her teeth into his chest. Rune roared and took the bite, tightening his hold as Kallan bit harder until she tasted blood. Nordri's sick smile beamed through the dark, and Kallan battled back the memory as his laughter pierced the shadows. The sick stench came back to her with that laugh. "Forget. Forget." And still Rune held her, unbending beneath her tantrum, until her strength waned and she released him. "You barely allow grief, let alone the pain you harbor," Rune spoke hurriedly into her ear. "If you won't thrash and scream at them, then come at me." Rune shook her. "Come at me!" He shook her again, but Kallan had fallen limp. "Or should I kiss you? Maybe then you'll feel something!" Kallan lay flaccid in his arms, saying nothing as she panted for breath. "Forget. You are weak, unable to confront even the slightest reality," he said. "Or did you enjoy the company of the Dvagar? Should I hand you back to them now?" Kallan didn't move as she shook with unrelenting venom reserved just for Rune, for the Dvagar, for the clothes on her back that came from the caves, all because of the king of Gunir. "What they did to you," Rune whispered. "That doesn't get to you even a little." "What they did to me," she whispered, hating the Lyasavar holding her. "What they did." But the words wouldn't form without tearing down the wall that had secured her sanity. Yes, Kala, Rune said. What they did to you. What they took from you. What they... Exhausted, Kallan slumped down into his arms and dropped her brow to his chest. Forget, or you'll break. Not here. Not with him. They're not here, Kallan, Rune said. They're miles away. Say it. But in silence she slept, her forehead resting against his chest, defeated. She breathed in his scent of spiced earth and wished her death would come swiftly. The green lights rippled across the sky in silence as Rune wondered once more why he couldn't hear the hooves of the horses and their battle cries. Sighing, he wrapped his arms around her, waiting for the moment in which Kallan would break beneath her grief, when she would acknowledge the abuse she had endured from the Devagar, her father's death, anything. Rune listened to her huff. Will you never break, princess? He whispered, touched his lips to her brow, unaware of the steady streams of hot tears that flowed down her face.